This video draws upon the events from the recently reviewed material from Star Trek Enterprise, the two-part storyline Demons and Terra Prime. The story, the final one from its then-current showrunner in its final season, shows the threat being made by Mr. Paxton of a group called Terra Prime, which wants humanity to have nothing to do with aliens, make all the aliens leave and never come back, and also stay out of humanity's way in the rest of the galaxy. Terra Prime represents an existential threat to the Federation that Star Trek is famous for, and before it has even been created, and can in many ways be considered the finale of the series as opposed to the actual finale for various deficiencies that I'm not going to get into right now. What makes this appropriate is not only that placement, but more accurately closing out the problem faced from the beginning of the show, that Captain Archer, as well as his friend and chief engineer Commander Tucker, both were unapologetic in their mistrust, if not outright hostility, towards Vulcans, putting them against adversaries who wants to show us that Vulcans and all other aliens need to go, shows this commonality between the villains and the heroes as they were at the start of their journey. That is one reason that I've created this video. The second reason is the realization that this conflict has been a long time coming, and that, as I think about that, realize it's not going away quickly. This episode didn't end the problem that has been long talked about. Finally, and what most immediately prompted this, was a high-ranking Terra Prime member justifying his viewpoint because the Vulcans didn't prevent the nuclear annihilation of World War III as part of a plan to dominate a weakened humanity. This is, amusingly, completely illogical. Yet this man clearly believes this idea, believes it enough to justify rising through the ranks of Terra Prime and participating in the hijacking of the controls of a powerful energy beam that could be used as a weapon. How can someone believe something so ridiculous? Thinking about it, I realized that all 3 points seem to tie back together to human psychology. Now, I realize that really, when you get down to it, most motivations can be thought of in terms of human psychology. But what I mean is it has to do with the irrational aspects of the way humans process things. I've had to have some education in psychology. It's part of being a teacher. You have to be educated in how people think in order to try to help kids think. However, that doesn't make me an expert. I've dabbled in it over the years, I've read about it, but I am not making any claims to expertise on the subject. However, as I was thinking about these issues, this stuff came to mind, so I've created this video as a way for me myself to work my way through this episode and apply these things that I've learned. But don't think that I'm pretending to be some kind of armchair expert who can tell you what that cigar really means. This is just one guy thinking out loud. When we looked at the first part, Demons, I talked about a rabble-rouser giving a speech about aliens on Earth. More than just hateful ranting and raving, he brought up various facts to back up his claim, statistics and studies and the like. I pointed out, using the fictional example of bigotry towards Martians, how such people can lie using absolutely true facts, that by omitting certain details about it, that facts can tell lies. This is an important tool because it takes advantage of a concept you've likely heard of before called confirmation bias. If I believe something to be true, I'll be more inclined to question things that challenge it than I will things which confirm it. Confirmation bias is increased by the force of emotion. For instance, if I told you that a famous person whom you greatly admire, an author, historical figure, a celebrity, was actually a child molester, your first reaction is that it's a myth because you can't see such a great person being such a monster. But if I said a politician that you despised was actually a child molester, your first reaction would be inclined to accept that. You always knew they were a monster, and this is just one more piece of truth. So if you already didn't trust Martians, and I fed you my misleading facts about Martians, you would be more inclined to accept it, further confirming what you already thought, and solidifying that belief all the more. Emotions are powerful, and they're supposed to be. Among other things, they're to help motivate us to stay alive and reproduce. So especially fear and sex get our attention. And because emotions are involved, this causes facts to become useless. Some are welcomed, but others are rejected. To help with this problem, our brain has a mechanism in place to sort out these issues, cognitive dissonance, that can arise when those unwelcome facts don't fit our picture. We don't want to admit that our viewpoints are based upon emotions that disregard reality, and so when a fact arises which is inconsistent with reality, we don't want to say, "I don't care about facts," because it suggests that you're not a rational person. I can't say I hate Vulcans because of their pointy ears and aloof attitudes, so I'll say that they're responsible for atrocities. I've already made up my mind. I'm just looking for a reason to justify it. We do this all the time. For the small stuff even. It's simply a human trait. I catch myself doing it sometimes. I have 2 children and I have a wife with mental issues, so I am used to hearing flimsy justifications for doing what they want to do rather than what is the right thing to do. So what I often do when I decide not to do something or to postpone something, I've tried to make it a habit to mentally explain to myself why I'm not going to do it and to apply the same BS detector I apply to their excuses to my own. Often, I catch myself doing something stupid or short-sighted that just a minute before seemed was perfectly reasonable. Our brains rationalize away the cognitive dissonance so that Chuck is a responsible person and Chuck is not going to work today somehow are completely compatible. I can see it clearly in others because I don't have the same emotional investment in the issue that they do. But in myself, it requires effort, and I'm sure I miss it a lot more often than I catch it. This aspect of ourselves is why political disagreements are so ugly. The viewpoints are emotional, which we know because facts crash against them with little effect and are rationalized away. But it is transparent to us in others who do not have that same emotional investment that can see that reality is being disregarded purely for being inconvenient. This is neither stubbornness nor stupidity. It's universal human nature. Recognizing this is very important because when this is being discussed, it frequently is misinterpreted as, "You're just too spineless to admit that the other viewpoint is wrong. You're trying to pretend that every view is equally right, and that's just stupid." What it means is that those who disagree have the same certainty of their truth as you do of yours, which is to say, built in your own mental fortress, as impenetrable as theirs is. Reinforced through confirmation bias, buttressing the walls, and redirecting away cognitive dissonance through creative inventions we're not even aware that we're doing. I am not saying that all viewpoints are equally correct. What I am saying is that people who disagree with you are no more likely to do so because they're malicious or stupid than you are. Because in all cases, there are human brains that are involved. And human brains simply work this way. Even if we don't want to admit it to ourselves, even if we don't want to admit that we are capable of confirmation bias or of bending in the face of cognitive dissonance, it's the truth. You can't, on the one hand, claim that you accept reality, and on the other, deny this fact. This ability of our brains is, in fact, an important defensive mechanism. When we're confronted with something that doesn't make sense, we can't afford to stop and try to figure it out, especially when it won't make any sense. Show a caveman one of Escher's paintings, you don't want him to stand there for forever trying to figure out how in the world this could possibly be there until a saber-toothed tiger walks up and eats him. Instead, our brain just says, Here, it makes sense. Now run, you damn fool, run!" Our brains rewrite things to eliminate a stress that is placed upon it, and the power to do so will, frankly, terrify you. One of the scariest examples of this is the false confession. I'm not referring to when people seeking attention come in off the streets and confess to some crime that's all over the news. I'm not even referring to cases where under intense interrogation, people might be driven to sign a confession just in a misguided belief that the ordeal will be over. No, what I'm referring to is a sadly common outcome. If you follow my reviews, you might have heard me mention that interrogators usually have a theme. It doesn't mean that they have decorated the interrogation room for enchantment under the sea or anything like that. It means they have a point for the interrogation to be built around, to lead the subject to cooperate them. It really wasn't your fault, for instance, or I get it, they had it coming. I might even have thought of doing it if I were you. The most common American police method is the read technique. So if you've watched detectives on TV, you probably have an idea of what is involved. But included is the fact that the police can lie to subjects and even make up evidence in an attempt to get them to confess. For instance, someone in their late teens finds his mother murdered and his father seriously wounded in an attack. He calls 911. He's panicked. He's stressed. And instead of going to the hospital, he's taken to the police station, put in a small room, and subjected to a barrage of questions, comments, and lies. Over the course of many, many hours, he's told their equipment has detected humidity consistent with him having showered. He hasn't showered, but if he had, it would explain why there is no blood on him. We spoke to the hospital. Your father, whom you know is an honest man who loves you, has come out of it and says that you did it. Everything you know says that none of it is true, but bombarded with it over and over, when your brain is stressed to the breaking point, it can lead some people, as it did for the poor unfortunate soul in this actual case, to start thinking that maybe they're all right. How do you reconcile everything they're telling you, everything you're being bombarded with? Your brain finally just fills in the gaps for you, resolves the conflicting realities in your head by inventing things to make sense of it. So you manufacture in your head you committing the crime that has been described to you. This is a horrifyingly common enough outcome to be terrifying to all of us. Not only can a person be talked into suffering the consequences of a crime they didn't commit, but being ravaged by guilt for performing horrendous actions they never did and would never do. One of the ways to try to prevent this is to record interrogations, but that runs into another bit of our crazy brains. When something is the focus, we assume that that is driving events. This was discovered in a rather amusing study. An experiment was created to test how people might perceive two others discussing a topic, whether one or the other was dominating the conversation or if they were neutral. For the experiment to work, the intention was that the two speakers had to have equal influence. So the scientist running the experiment was frustrated during rehearsals when one or the other of them would begin to dominate. The scientist was finally interrupted by her colleagues who were observing to say that she was mistaken. Every single time the speakers were being neutral, they all agreed on it. The scientist realized she had unwittingly proven her hypothesis before even beginning the experiment, which is that we perceive the focal point of our attention to be controlling events. Whoever's face she was looking at then, she was perceiving as dominating the conversation, while those who could see both at the same time, by viewing from the side, saw it more objectively. This is why those interrogation recordings are a problem, because by focusing on the suspect alone, even if the interrogator can be heard, the viewer presumes that the suspect is driving the conversation. When it's reversed, when you show the interrogator and not the suspect, it looks like the opposite is true. The interrogator is driving the events. If you show a jury just the suspect's face in the video, they'll conclude that a guilty man or woman has just confessed. If you show the same jury the same interrogation, but with the interrogator's face being shown only, it looks to them like an overzealous cop coercing an innocent man or woman into falsely confessing. This tendency is the reason that Paxton accompanies his speech with the image of the human-Vulcan hybrid baby. It's a technique known as channeled attention, a means of influencing your behavior by putting something in your head before attempting to convince you. For example, my Twitter followers can attest that I have been repeatedly visited by door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesmen. The first one arrived dressed in a plaid jacket with Buddy Holly glasses and asks if I had heard of the, and he says some string of numbers and letters too fast. So I asked, "What's that?" Rather than answering, he immediately ran off to his car to get his vacuum and bring it back, running in a loping, goofy kind of way. He probably wasn't familiar with the exact psychological ideas behind it, or else he wouldn't be selling vacuum cleaners door to door, but he was nevertheless using channeled attention to prime me with his somewhat clownish behavior. By setting that up ahead of time, I'd be more inclined to lower any defenses I might have against whatever he was here for, and thus be more receptive to his sales pitch. When I made clear that that wasn't going to work, his next tactic was to attempt to make me feel sorry for him, having run all that way and hauled this huge heavy vacuum cleaner up onto my porch only to be dismissed, to again make me more receptive to his sales pitch by putting me in a sympathetic mindset, thus making the sale more likely. Now, neither attempt worked because I work at home and being interrupted by a clown creates a negative disposition that his efforts are unable to overcome. In other words, his very arrival has created an unexpected channel attention to the fact that I don't like him. I can tell you with absolute certainty that his behavior is their established sales technique because a second and third visit by different people was conducted almost exactly the same way. Paxton's choice in making an innocent infant a symbol may seem odd, but the channeled attention it delivers is a 1-2 punch against the people hearing his argument. Emotion, remember, can overrule facts, and by bringing up the fact that Paxton is bringing up a human-Vulcan hybrid immediately causes the brain to fill in the blanks, or so they think, of how it came to be. Mating between a human and a Vulcan. And sex, remember, draws attention. Having that attention, Paxton uses the child to represent fear, because the fear of our children being deformed, or a fear of a child being a demon-spawned monster, are powerful emotions as well. A human-looking child that clearly isn't human focuses attention and provides a fearful background, to thus provide the explanation of why Paxton's extreme behavior is necessary and why his solution is the only reasonable action. He hasn't presented facts. He's hitting the emotions of his audience to convince them that he's right. It won't convince everyone. It won't even convince most, but it will at least open the door for some of them. That baby is a symbol, and as the thing being given attention, our brains, remember, presume it's the most important. This kind of thing can lead to irrationality in even the most mundane of places. Many years ago, I noticed a sudden spike of activity on one particular page of my website and discovered it was from an author who was doing freelance work for a major fictional property. The page didn't seem relevant, having to do with how best to engage in behavior on the internet, written back in the wild, wild west days of the web. I was curious as to why the author would be so interested that they would not only come to my website, but actually direct traffic to me. And what I discovered was fascinating. Now, I won't get into the details of it because they're not important. It's the behavior that I want you to see, because it's a great demonstration of what we've been talking about. The author had written on the fictional military involved in this property, which again, it's not their original intellectual property. It's just a work-for-hire job for another company. Well, fans noted that one particular detail of it didn't make any sense. It was one number amongst the entire work, set in a fictional world. It would never matter to anyone ever, except those interested in the details of this fictional world. Yet the author took affront at this. Now, one cannot know the mind of another, but it was strongly implied that the author styled themselves as being an authority on military matters, and so it was likely that being corrected by the public was offensive. Yet the engagement didn't get the author anywhere. They insisted their number was correct. The fans countered with logical reasoning why the number simply couldn't have been what they had stated. And the author was irate. Not because the fans wouldn't listen, but because there was no actual argument, no logical proof of why their reasoning was flawed. Nothing other than because I, the expert, said so. The author finally wrote a short story which retconned essentially the entire military conflict to prove that the figures used by the author's critics weren't true. Thus, the originally presented number was correct and logical. The author's actions thus satisfied the cognitive dissonance of, "I'm an expert," with, "This number shows I'm not." By saying the flaw is not with me, the problem is with everything else. Yet all they had done was rationalized away the mental conflict. The course of action was actually self-defeating. By redefining the world to make themselves correct, the author was admitting their opponents were correct, because the only way to make this number be logical was to change what was being used to calculate it. Essentially, trying to win an argument with your bathroom scale by cutting off your own foot before stepping on it. How could the author have made such a glaring misstep as to not only admit all their critics had been right all along, but crow about it on social media as if they were the victor? Because, as mentioned, we presume that what we give our attention to is the most important thing. Because the attention was on the number, it seemed that the number being correct was what was really important, rather than the logic, which an expert should have, that justified or disproved that number. This aspect of human behavior is the reason why the Terra Prime issue is only just beginning, and demonstrates why the villain acted as he did. First, by ensuring that there would be plenty of time to evacuate the buildings that he intended to fire upon, and trying to persuade Commander Tucker to ensure his attack would solely strike a bunch of empty buildings. Blasting a city and killing hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands would cause his face and his cause to be played side by side with footage of this disaster, and thus be associated in the minds of the public with mass murder. The power of association would cause them to think of him and senseless death as being one and the same. But limiting the act merely to property damage, to symbols rather than to people, shows he is only attacking the system that enables the issue. The tragedy is minimized because no one was actually harmed by his actions. So the story of what happened is no longer about a tragic mass murder, it's about this crazy confrontation by extremists over the issue of alien presence among humans. Avoiding associating himself with strong negative images and emotions leaves the way free for the second aspect of this plan to work. Paxton certainly knew that their situation could never be permanent, but this action would have the effect of making what Terra Prime was doing and why they were doing it a fact known to all of humanity. And remember, what we give attention to, we believe must be important. Thus, the issue that Terra Prime was fighting for is an important issue, which forces a conversation about it. For an historical example, let's take a look at the 2016 American presidential race. Immigration was one of the largest issues in that race, while it was a minor issue in the 2012 race. What changed in those 4 years? It wasn't that the issues of 2012 were no longer relevant, they still were and are, or that immigration had changed drastically in that time. All that had changed was that it was being talked about more, and discussing it makes it more important. People who had little to no opinion on the immigration issue now began to develop one purely because it was being discussed. Likewise, simply causing the conversation to now be about the presence of aliens in human life was going to make their issue important. It wouldn't make people agree with Terra Prime, but it would compel those who paid little attention to the issue to discuss it, to form an opinion about it. As has been noted, the press has little power to tell people what to think, but has tremendous power to tell people what to think about. So even if they lose, Terra Prime wins by making everyone talk about the issue that matters to them. This increased conversation on the topic will both introduce the possibility of expanding the size of their supporters on the issue, but also to motivate the rank and file. Even losing this particular conflict won't actually change anything, won't convince them that they've lost the fight, any more than any political party is destroyed if it loses an election. The viewpoint is a threat to the future of the Federation here. So, how would this be resolved? The easy response would be to try to stamp them out, but I said easy response, not easy answer, because it's not going to actually solve the problem. The least convincing thing you can do when someone thinks that you're out to get them is to show you're out to get them. And they won't all simply evaporate because they have been defeated and their viewpoint is offensive. On the individual level, it returns to recognizing how the brain responds with confirmation bias and to cognitive dissonance. That strong emotions are what empower those walls. That by reducing the power of resisting emotions, it allows a penetration of those defenses. This was seen with the innocent murder suspect whose defenses were lowered to the point where he was convinced he was a murderer simply because of excess stress. Or we learn that sleep deprivation will cause artillery units that, under normal circumstances, would refuse to bombard civilian targets, would now obey an order to bomb a civilian hospital without question. However, as noted, the brain will resolve the conflict even if it must invent something to do it. This is why there is a strong movement against torture, or even what some would consider borderline torture, such as sleep deprivation, beyond the moral aspect of it all. Stress may not only lead to deliberate deception, but it can lead to the unintended deception of our brain inventing something purely to resolve the stress. Building bridges achieves far more, as has been noted, such as how Abu Jandal began cooperating with American investigators until 9/11 after demonstrating personalized acts of compassion towards him. As a society, it likewise requires building bridges, because to do so lowers emotional resistance so that the brain's defense mechanism can power down and the mind be receptive to facts and views that under other circumstances would have been dismissed out of hand. After all, this was how it convinced Archer, Tucker, and most other Vulcan skeptical crew members to change their ways of thinking. The human mind is powerful, both in its resistance and in its pliability. It can be used towards bad ends, or can create the unified society that the Federation ideal represents.